Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast. I am going to dispense with asking what we are all drinking today. I think we've got a serious topic that we're discussing. And for me, I'm really here to drink in the experiences of people who have experienced life differently from me. So we have got with us today Izabella Tabarovsky and Asra Nomani to speak with us about the current rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen over the past week in the wake of the Israel-Palestine conflict and how that's kind of playing out across the world, but also specifically in the United States. And before I introduce you to a little bit more, I just wanted to let you know where I'm coming from. And I think I'm so excited about this conversation because we all just have so many different life experiences. And I come to this conversation, I think from a kind of the dominant in America, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, perspective, but I come at it very, very, very concerned and in what I'm seeing and how we are manipulating a lot of the narratives, and in my desire to find our common humanity across this conversation. And so with that said, I'll introduce both of my guests here today, and then we'll kind of get started on what we're seeing happening as a result of, or not as a result of, but in the wake of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I've got Asra Nomani. She is an author. One of her books, Standing Alone, An American Woman's Struggle for the Soul of Islam. She is a Muslim reformer. She's a former professor, news correspondent, and recently helped to start Parents Defending Education. I also have Izabella Tabarovsky. She is a researcher at the Wilson Institute. She researches on the Holocaust, and she actually coordinates the U.S.-Israel Working Group on Russia and the Middle East. And she's currently working on a book and doing her research right now, actually in Israel and Jerusalem. So with those introductions, Isabella, I'm going to start with you. And I know you've written a lot recently on anti-Semitism, and your background as a Russian Jewish immigrant, you are very familiar with propaganda and how propaganda was used in your early, used today even, but you saw it from a very unique perspective coming from the former Soviet Union. So can you give us a background of what you are seeing happening now in this rise of anti-Semitism in the wake of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and how that's affecting the way we're communicating?
Sure. Thank you so much for this introduction, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with Asra because I think I would love to hear. I think there's a lot to be gained with the kind of dialogue that we're attempting here. Look, I think one of the most sort of distressing things for all of us who are who are close sort of observers and are ourselves Jewish, but also researchers and who are online. One of the most distressing things for us to see over the past 2 weeks was the narrative, and more than the narrative, really the hate that rose as Israel and Hamas exchanged fire, etc. That was just look. Some of it is something that I have been hearing since my childhood in the Soviet Union. You have tropes that actually were invented in the Soviet Union, such as Zionism is racism, Zionism is fascism, or Israel is a fascist state, or Israel is a settler colonial apartheid state. Like, these were propaganda tropes that were developed specifically for the Soviet kind of foreign policy purposes. And to see them appropriated today is extremely, 30 years after the Soviet Union has disappeared, to see them rise to the surface over the past 2 years, and especially over the last 10 days, is extremely disturbing, because I understand that these are propaganda tropes, but some people actually think that they are criticisms of Israel. There is a big difference. There is a difference between how we criticize and how we demonize. And what we saw over the last 10 days, 2 weeks, was this increasing levels of demonization that were supported from the top, from some of the people in Congress. And when the violence broke out against Jews in the streets of American cities, and we saw it in London and in Berlin, um, it was silence. There was such a, it's like nobody could really condemn it in the right way. And then condemnations came, but in a very kind of half-hearted, tepid way. And we can get more into it in a very kind of mealy-mouthed and watered-down way. So I find it very distressing. This moment is very, very distressing to me as an American Jew, because I feel like some evil forces have been unleashed. And we know from history that once you unleash the forces of anti-Semitism, it's very hard to put them back in. So I'll maybe stop here and let Asra respond. I wonder how you see what's happening.
Yeah, I find it fascinating that you're talking about those tropes emerging out of the Soviet Union. I want to just explore that for just a second, because I want our listeners too to learn with me. So they actually, the idea, I just want to focus on the idea of Israel as an apartheid colonizer came out of the Soviet Union. It was one of the memes that was sort of before the meme word was invented.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was, look, all of this came, it's one of the things that I'm researching now, and I'm reading all of these propaganda books which the Soviets put out, which is a very depressing reading. But yeah, absolutely, they developed these memes. It was the KGB that developed them. Why did they do it? Because they viewed Israel. It really goes back to 1967 and the Six-Day War.
Right.
That is when, Israel was supposed to be defeated. The Soviet-supported Arab states were supposed to win.
Right.
They were obviously overwhelming, right?
Right.
Overwhelming force. They were supported and supplied
Right.
and trained by the Soviet Union.
Right.
When they lost, it created a massive crisis on the Soviet side, and they needed to figure out how to. They suddenly felt like, wow, there is somebody in the Middle East, and of course, the Middle East is a crucial area at that point,
Yeah.
who is an ally of the United States and has just won. And how did they win? Well, there must be something. There must be some kind of big conspiracy there or something like that. And that is when they begin to work
Uh,
to demonize Zionism, to demonize Israel. And they begin to pull on the same age-old anti-Semitic tropes, only
right.
substituting Zionist for Jew.
Okay.
And yeah,
Excellent. I think it's just so important to have that sense of the history, because we have to know where these things came from to understand what we're battling today.
yeah,
And that was enlightening for me too. So I will just say that, I came to this country, the United States, as a young Muslim girl. I was just 4 years old. It was the summer of 1969. So I grew up in America, and it was in 1979. I was 10 years old that the Iranian Revolution happened, with the Shia uprising in Iran, and then concurrently the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and the Saudi influence emerged. And so, in the context of the already antagonism that the Soviets had against Israel from the embarrassing defeat of the 1967 war, now Israel becomes a part of the targeted um, demonization of the Sunnis, the Saudis, and the Shias, the Iranians, as they want to create another enemy, right, for Muslims to hate. And so that's what I grew up with. I just wanted to kind of give that context, because it was then that I started hearing in my own Muslim community, the the narrative that had really been percolating through the decades of Israel's existence, but had became, now amplified about this oppressive regime. And this was just, in the 1979, before all of the events that are to, proceed over the next decades. And it was then that I also knew that at our mosque, we started preaching these kind of anti-Israel sentiments, and this is decades ago, right? And And I'll just make it very personal too, which is I moved to West Virginia, and I was a Muslim girl growing up in a conservative family. When I got the little permission slip to learn to dance at school in sixth grade, my mom said, "Oh no, not acceptable," because no good Muslim girl dances with a boy. And she wouldn't sign the permission slip, but I was, paying back then too. And I got my mom to sign the permission slip. And sure enough, then one day I went to school and we learned to square dance because that's what you learn to do in West Virginia. And my dance partner was a boy by the name of David Stitzel. He was from a Jewish family, and his mom was creating the women's studies department down the road at West Virginia University. At no point in my family's, story was that an issue. It was just me dancing with a boy. I didn't grow up at all with that narrative of the Jews as the enemy or Israel as an enemy state. In fact, my name, Asra, is the story of this mythical journey that the Prophet Muhammad made from Mecca to Jerusalem on a winged horse. I call it Pegasus. And then from there, he went to the Dome of the Rock and then did the ascension to the heavens. That's the way the story goes. And one day, I hope you can go to the mosque that's underground at Al Aqsa, and there's literally a ring of a horse's, what you tie a horse
Wow.
to. Yeah, and I went
Wow.
there. Yeah, I went there, and the guide was like, "And this is where the horse was tied up." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, the poor horse is like flown from Mecca to Jerusalem, and now he gets tied." Like, oh, totally.
That's funny.
Yeah,
That's funny. I want to, can I just ask you to
yeah,
just just like what you did with my story? I want to go
yeah,
back for a second to 1979.
yeah.
So are you saying that that is when you first began to hear the whole anti-Zionist kind of preaching and all that? Is that
Yes,
when?
yes, I did in my life because that in
Mhm,
my young life, right?
mhm.
It was obviously part of the narrative from the Muslim Brotherhood and all of the political Islam groups that had been emerging through the 50s and 60s in Pakistan, in India, in Egypt, all over the world. But I remember specifically going to the home of a family friend who had just become indoctrinated into this political party called Jamaat Islami, and then he was also affiliated with a sort of a missionary group of Muslims called Tablighi Jamaat. And it was there then that first started hearing, the anti-Jewish, anti-Israel sentiments again and again and over again, and it was a reality that I just um, separated in my mind, and it was really because it wasn't like I was saying, it wasn't the reality of my family, so I didn't confront it. And then, in my story, the moment that I finally faced the reality of this horror was January 23rd, 2002, when my colleague from the Wall Street Journal, Danny Pearl, left this home that I had been renting in Karachi, Pakistan, for an interview. And then, as you know, he never came back. And I have just right behind me his book. I keep it as a reminder because it's the book that his father and mother created, where people have their personal reflections on Danny's last words, "I am Jewish," and that was the moment when I understood that this was a matter of life or death. Like
Right.
I literally then saw these criminals take Danny's Jewish identity and his Israel ancestry and use it and weaponize it to slay him in the most brutal of ways. And when I watched the propaganda video, I saw not only this beautiful soul stolen from this earth, but their propaganda messages, all throughout. They have all of the fabrications along with the news footages and this and that of their propaganda. And And the alarming story that we have to talk about is how this is now playing out today, and it
Right.
is very much playing out today.
Exactly. Well, I think that, you just brought it from words to action. And that is exactly what I think is so, not I think, I know is so concerning, because uh, people either don't know, or they don't realize, or they don't want to confront this fact that certainly, but when you go out into the streets and you chant messages that you say, well, they're criticisms of Israel. I'm just criticizing Israel. When I say that Zionists are racists, or when I say that Zionists are white supremacists, I'm just criticizing Israel. It's actually not criticism of Israel. It's propaganda. And, you can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. Jews do it all day long, right? Like Jews in America do it all day long. Jews in Israel do it all day long. It's like we all criticize Israel all the time. You don't have to become anti-Semitic while doing it. One way that you do it, for example, one way that it turns anti-Semitic, and it was so obvious, there's so much on display this past 2 weeks, is the questioning of the legitimacy of Israel, the questioning of Israel's right to exist. And at some point, when you repeat it often enough, it becomes so destabilizing. For me as a Jew, it's like even though I have it's like I know how propaganda works, but I also can observe when you hear it all the time, you just feel like, my God, they really want to like murder this state. It's truly incredible, because you don't ever hear this rhetoric about any other country, right? Like we can criticize France, for example, for I don't know, for how poorly it integrated its Muslims. We can criticize it for all kinds of policies that its government is conducting, but you will never hear somebody say, well, France needs to be erased from the face of the earth. And they say it with Israel all the time. And
Because that's their goal. I mean, that's right. I don't mean to interrupt you, but
No,
that's
please.
exactly the clarity that people have to have, that the objective is not, a peaceful solution. The objective is to eliminate Israel. And if you believe that this nation has a right to exist, then you have to stop being naive. And I just want to connect the dots too. Again, while you were speaking, I pulled up this tweet, a tweet that was put forward by a school board member. And this is what connects the dots to how this is not only the stuff of like high level propagandists, but also at the lowest levels of political governance in America. So this school board member in my home county here in Fairfax County, Virginia, her name is Abrar Omesh. And she wrote on Eid Mubarak, congrats on 30 days of worship. Hurts my heart to celebrate while Israel kills Palestinians and desecrates the Holy Land. So she captures the Holy Land and the killing. So hurts my heart to celebrate while Israel kills Palestinians and desecrates the Holy Land right now. Apartheid and colonization were wrong yesterday and will be today, here and there. And so, Isabella, you see how just masterful and just strategic this is? Because from what we just learned from you, she's capturing the trope that the Soviets put forward decades ago, bringing it into today's world, putting up this beautiful smiling picture of herself and her brothers with masks on and a wide smile with like her bright teeth. And then, but the thing is, who is this Abrar Omesh? She is the daughter of a man named Issam Omesh. Issam Omesh is a Libyan American who helped start and lead this mosque here in Fairfax County, Virginia, called Dar al Hijra. Dar al Hijra Mosque is where the Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers pray. It is called the 9/11 Mosque because it is where the hijackers prayed. Her father was part of the hiring group that hired Anwar al-Awlaki the imam who went to Yemen and was then later killed by a US drone. I mean, if you're not getting chills right now, I don't know what can alarm us more, but this is a machine, you know, and guess what? I went to the school board meeting last Thursday and I was shocked. There were hundreds of people there because the Jewish groups, some of them, not enough of them, but some of them came out against her tweet, and they she and her father and that whole network here in Virginia, including the American Muslims for Palestine and all of these others, brought out about a couple hundred people with the drums to protest any kind of censor of this woman. And and there I stood, and you can't even imagine. I turned around, and there behind me was the founding member of the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is one of the organizations pushing boycott, divest, sanctions movement in America. Yeah, Isabella, isn't it just giving you chills? And this is how it's all like connecting and it's all penetrating into American society.
Well, that's right. And what makes this moment especially dangerous is that it is connecting with something that has become part of the American mainstream, that has come together with what we call the woke ideology,
Yeah.
right? That fits all of this so well, like hand in glove, right? The critical race theory, which views Jews as white adjacent and in fact white and supporting white supremacy, and therefore
look at the next book that I've got right next to that book, because that's exactly the ideology that these people are exploiting. Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so when you have suddenly positioned Jews as white, which is extraordinary because no one ever considered Jews as white, right? No one who ever killed the Jews ever considered them white. And now suddenly when whiteness is actually not a sort of a benefit, but it's the worst thing that exists, then Jews are equated with the whiteness. And then it allows you to just smear them with all kinds of epithets and just disregard completely the Jewish history of oppression, the vulnerability of the Jewish community, which it always is, because there are always, there are traditional haters from the right, but now we have the haters from the far left who are armed with this ideology, who are supported by this supposedly pro-Palestine movement. Because you're not going to help Palestinians by beating up Jews in New York. Right? You're not going to help Palestinians by, declaiming anti-Semitic slogans. And yet somehow they're still considered to be pro-Palestinian, and they're still supposed to be considered to be the good people. They're considered to be in the right. So,
well, and I want to jump in here too, because Isabella and I were talking the other day, Asra, because she said, I wonder if it's more than just what we're seeing on social media. And this is where I feel that we are at a kind of inflection here with how we have conversations in the US beyond anti-Semitism, but it is that oppressor oppressed binary that critical race theory and critical social justice ideology really uses as its linchpin for all conversations. And so what I was telling Isabella is, because that has been such a influential force in our society, in our, this, from parents defending education, in our education platforms. And a lot of times people don't even recognize how much it's kind of infiltrated into our conversation. And particularly with young kids, I think this is why you and I are on the same page with parents defending education. There's not even that language. It's just something that has infiltrated into the way that we think. And so I see, particularly with the Israel-Palestine situation, I have seen, not only have we seen physically people in the street in America, an uptick in violence against Jews, but we've also seen this play out. I've seen it with some of the young kids that I speak with, because it's very much, it's very black and white. Why are you killing young kids?
Right.
And that's it. And they assume that's the end of the conversation. Like, you should know that it's a moralistic thing. Like, and there's no other, because that's how much I believe critical race theory has come into our mindset, our daily
Yeah,
interactions.
yeah, it's a machine. It's a real machine. And, for anyone that isn't familiar with the ideas of critical race theory, it basically has put forward this notion that all inequity, as the word that they like to use, that might exist in the United States is due to systemic racism, and that we all have to be judged by the color of our skin. And if you happen to be Jewish, you're going to now be put into the white basket. If you're a successful Asian, you're now put into the white basket. And it becomes this oppression Olympics that dehumanizes everyone. I felt it very directly because they went after my son's high school in Virginia, the school called Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, about 70% Asians, and they decided that that was the wrong kind of minority. And so, yeah, Isabella,
It's
Jews,
just,
Jews, Jews have heard this before, right? Yeah,
we have
yeah,
heard it, and I'll tell you something. I've also heard this in the Soviet Union, where they also tried to manipulate the nationalities issues, as they called it. Especially in ethnicities. They always try to like manipulate how many people of this ethnicities are here and how many of this ethnicity are there. And what happened is when the Soviet Union fell apart, the anger that so many people had. I mean, it basically broke out at the edges. You had all this ethnic conflict all the time, in part because of all of these manipulations. And so that was my first thought when I got kind of acquainted with the critical race theory. That and also the Nazi race laws, but it's kind of comes from both sides.
yeah. And what I noticed here is that they decided that they would then now have uh, race-based admissions process. So what they have done is they have put discrimination into the process. They have made racism acceptable, and in the name of quote anti-racism. And in fact, the architect Ibram Kendi of one of these ideas is says that you have to have new discrimination in order to fix old discrimination. This literally comes out of his book, my next book that I have. Everybody's getting a tour of my bookshelf. But what we're seeing here is this and just the books that I've got, the intersection, to use their word, of all of these bad ideas. But what is really disturbing to me is um, that these ideas of racism are now becoming part of our state sanctioned educational process. And
Yeah.
and too that they're going after the curriculum. In California, there's been a huge battle over this thing called the Ethnic Studies program because the Palestinian activists like Hatem Bazian, who is a big sponsor of the boycott, divest, sanctions movement in America, he has put forward a lot of the anti-Israel propaganda through this organization called American Muslims for Palestine. Well, he and others started working to penetrate K through 12 curriculum in California. And the Jewish organizations had to like really stand up strong, but it's a huge battle. I mean, they have their eyes set on the curriculum, and just like Jennifer said, the things that our children think. And so what's happening is that we are really going to face this problem. Sorry about that. Where there is our kids repeating this propaganda.
Well, and again, I want to say that, when you hear people say that, well, uh, your accusations of anti-Semitism are actually, with those accusations, you're trying to shut us up. You're trying to stop us from being able to criticize Israel. And it's not like that at all. As I said before, of course, we have to criticize. We have to be able to criticize anybody and everything, but we can do it without lapsing into tropes that provoke anti-Semitic reactions. And there is a way to do it. There is the International Holocaust International Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which is very thoughtful and very considerate, which says that, explains when these tropes become anti-Semitic and when they don't. And now there is a this powerful movement to actually like bring down this definition so that people don't adopt it, precisely because some people want to be able to be anti-Semitic when they
Right.
talk about Israel and Palestine.
And
I want to, well, go ahead, and I want to
yeah, I was
ask you a
just gonna
question.
say that Danny's dad, for example, really promotes the idea that people have to own up to their Zionophobia. That's he's using,
Yes.
yeah, he's using, their terms against them and using and basically dealing with the reality, which is that Zionism has become, the new excuse to be anti-Semitic, and we can all see through it. Ultimately, I know what is at the heart of the campaigns on Israel, and it is not to have a two-state solution. It is to have a one-state solution with a return of Palestinians to the quote homeland, and ultimately demographically outnumbering the Jews that are in Israel, and they're not even secret about this as their agenda. Like they justify it now, and that's what they're trying to make normative in people's thinking, and so that kids will argue this at Model United Nations seminars, and
Yes.
they'll be the activists for this.
Well, that's exactly right, and it's very interesting that you say it, because um, a lot of times it's actually it's a factor that some people don't understand. If I can plug a book by someone who I respect very much, Einat Wilf. She is a former left-wing politician in Israel. She's now an analyst, speaks a lot on these subjects. So she and Adi Schwartz wrote a book called The Right of Return. So
Mm.
it is about this idea that they're saying that basically the one thing that has prevented peace from being from coming or from this conflict from being resolved in a peaceful way is the fact that there is this demand that all of the descendants of the original Palestinian refugees should have a right to come back, not into the new Palestinian state that will be created, but into the sovereign Israel, And so yes, absolutely, in order to overwhelm Israel demographically so that it is erased from the face of the earth. And I really appreciate you saying it, because I think that it is something that a lot of times is misunderstood. And again, people will blame Israel and they will say, well, Israel is so incalcitrant and it really doesn't want to, right? But of course, because it doesn't want to be wiped out, when this is the demand, it's a
Right.
demand that Israel can't meet.
Yeah, you just like I'm glad you appreciate me saying it out loud, because I feel like people also forget this idea. It would just be like any people saying, "Oh, we all want to come back and flood your country with our numbers," and basically then there's and we see how they're using words as propaganda, because they're pushing for quote democracy, right? So then when they are demographically outnumbering the Israeli Jews, then they can outvote them. Like it's so obvious, like do the math,
Right,
even though math
right.
is racist according to critical race theory. But in this case, it's exponential, right? What they're accomplishing. And I've traveled to Israel now, I guess 3 times, and
Wonderful.
yeah, I'm really happy to have been there, and I'm envious that you're in Jerusalem right now, because I do believe it is a profound place, and I went the last time, and I did go across into the West Bank, and I had a former student who lived in Bethlehem. She was one of the last Palestinian Christian families that are living there. And she has left now because even Palestinian Christians do not feel welcome in that homeland. And so this is a reality that people have to confront, that this is what is happening now also within the Palestinian movement. Is it's not just that secular movement, that existed decades ago. It is now an Islamist movement. Hamas is very much an Islamist regime. They demand, strict interpretation of Islam so that you cannot be LGBTQ. Forget about any other acronym. You are unwelcome. I met so many young women who were living in the neighborhoods that are called refugee camps, but of course they're not tents like I was imagining. They are completely constructed cities, departments, and mosques. And they said that they were afraid to walk through their neighborhood without a scarf on their head now, because that's the interpretation, like a very orthodox interpretation. And you and I are both probably very much aligned to in like rejecting orthodoxy in all interpretations. Um, and then when I traveled, through Hebron, Ramallah, all of these areas, I saw, thriving economies too. I saw the big billboards of millions of dollars of aid that the UN and the government of Japan and US have provided. I went and had dates, in the front lawn of a millionaire that lived off on the outskirts of Hebron. I mean, the notion, the propaganda that's being put forward about life there is also very skewed. Of course, I also struggled for hours to get through the checkpoint, right? But the checkpoint is a reality that became invented because of this, violence. And so
Exactly.
everything is so complicated. And I stood where the graffiti is on the wall, right between Israel territory and those territories. And it's awful. It is an awful thing to witness and to experience, um, but it's the result of this decades of violence that Israel has faced, and that's something that we have to be honest about too. And it's really not fair to dismiss it.
Well, that's right. And I think when people say that it's an Israel-Palestine conflict, I actually want to prefer to
Yeah.
say that it's an Israel-Hamas conflict,
Yes.
because Israeli people are not at war with the Palestinians, and I think people here really, really wish with all their heart that people in Gaza will prosper. And that was, in fact, the idea when Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. There were plans, right? There were plans that there would be, in fact, Jewish donors were planning to come and donate just lots and lots of money to turn it into this great port on the Mediterranean. Some Jewish businesses were going to be transferred to the Palestinian owners. And look where it all ended. Hamas won, and that's it. And they've been running it since then, and they're using all the money to arm themselves and build uh, sorry, I have the Hebrew word in my head. The tunnels, which they use they try to kind of transfer it. First of all, they hide and they try to like dig into the Israeli territory. And that's not to say that Israelis haven't made mistakes. Of course they have. The government has made lots of mistakes, and I'm sure it could have handled things much better. But in the end, you have to acknowledge that you're dealing with a terrorist organization whose goal is to wipe Israel off the
Yeah.
face of the earth.
Yeah. That's
And I
you can't forget that. That's
you can't,
yeah.
you can't. And in fact, I want to, for those of our listeners who maybe are not so tuned into this, like the chant that's very, very popular in the
Right.
US these days, it pro-Palestinian rallies, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, right? What does it mean? So from River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free. It means it will be free of Jews.
Right.
So it's basically a genocidal chant. And when I first heard American students chant it a few years ago, I was just shocked. And then
Oh,
they told me, well, but it's not anti-Semitic, it's only anti-Zionist. And I was like, wow,
it gives me
wow.
chills. And I will just say that I was watching hours of these marches from just a week ago because I wanted to find that moment, because I knew that moment existed where the marchers were chanting from the river to the sea, Israel will be free. And this was just here in Washington, D.C. And who was it that organized it? But the American Muslims for Palestine, the same organization that was then at the rally supporting our local school board member in her anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic tweet that she had posted out. So I hope that folks can understand like how insidious this has become and what the stakes are. because it is existential. It is like I lost my friend Danny as an extension of this type of sentiment. They had him speak about his family in Israel. And in one of my trips to Israel, I did a pilgrimage to the place in Bnei Brak, where he said in the murder video that they broadcast to the world that his ancestor, Chaim Pearl, had helped to start the state of Israel. And there's a street in Bnei Brak that is named for him. So I stood at that corner. Yeah, in Isabella, in homage and in honor of Danny's ancestor and Danny's life and Danny's parents, because this is a reality, and around me were families circulating, and the hope that these modern day critical race theory people have, where Black Lives Matter connects with the anti-Israel movement. They not only chant from the river to the sea, they're now chanting from Ferguson to Palestine. Like that's the connection, right, Isabella? That's the connection. And from
Right.
Ferguson to Palestine means that they stand on Haim Pearl Street and they claim it also. They claim it and they name it and they rename it and they eliminate the Jews that live there now. And those are the stakes that we have to recognize we're
Well,
dealing.
and I think first of all, I want to thank you so much for sharing this story and for doing what you did, because I mean, this is, this is like, I think what Jen said earlier when you opened the podcast, right? This is about sharing our common humanity, right? Like, or honoring your friend, going to visit the street that was meaningful to your friend. That transcends everything, and we need more of that in this terrible, terrible conflict where there are so many forces. The conflict itself is terrible, right? But because there's so many external forces that are trying to manipulate it and insert their narratives in it, and you just mentioned from Ferguson to what is it, to Palestine, right? I mean, this is another thing. Gosh, it's so we need like a 3-hour podcast on this. But
Chilling,
but this is
chilling,
was that it's chilling. It's
very
exactly. Well, because what they're doing, and I will just explain it also to the listeners who may not be so attuned to it, is that they're taking American racial issues, as interpreted, by the way, in a very distorted way through the critical race theory, and they're imposing them onto the Israeli-Palestine conflict to make it understandable to the American audiences. And and it has nothing to do with reality. I mean, when they say that Israelis are white supremacists, and the Palestinians are people of color, there is nothing more absurd than that you could say, because again, I was just rereading an article that Einat Wilf wrote. As she said that she tells the story of how she was teaching a seminar to a group of foreign students in Jaffa, which is a very mixed city, and there was a student who posed her the question about color in Israel, skin color, and she said to her, look, walk out into the street of Jaffa and tell me who is a Jew and who's an Arab. Can you tell?
right.
It's impossible to tell. But they impose this toxic, this lens is toxic in America anyway. And it toxifies the conversation about Israel. And so it becomes impossible to actually have a practical conversation
Well,
about things.
well, if you wonder about myself, I come completely from India. My parents and both my mom and my dad and all of my ancestry. But when I walked through Israel, I just felt like I was among my own people, Arab, Jew, whatever, Christian, whatever the external identity, like I felt like I was among my own people. And, in my reporting, I also went to the street corner in Ferguson where Michael Brown was killed and where the marches began. And I went there because Linda Sarsour is one of the Palestinian American activists that has weaponized, the American civil rights struggle for her intention to destroy Israel. She stood at that street corner in Ferguson, and she chanted from Ferguson to Palestine because she's part of this machine, yeah, this anti-Israel machine. And it's just like you said, they're just using the civil rights struggle here for their own purpose. And they're able to exploit this whole idea of critical race theory because with critical race theory, you look at everything through the racial lens. And what they do is they create this white supremacist, just like you said, of the Israeli person, so that every Israeli now that they describe is the white European, like as if that just that's such a that's just their criticism of history in America. All they're doing is whitewashing, right? The Jewish experience. Um,
Completely.
and
Most Israelis are from Arab countries.
yeah,
They look exactly like, they're from North Africa. They're from the Middle East. They're from Iran, from Iraq. You can't tell them apart.
well, you're not seeing on my neck right now is the necklace that I just couldn't find right now, but I'm always usually wearing it, and it is the hand of Fatima, as we call it, and Hamza. You know the the charm that is meant to for protection. And I got mine at the King David Gate in Jerusalem, and as a symbol to me of the need for both protection and connection amongst us as we try to sort all of these propaganda tricks and these multi-million dollar funded machines of propaganda and the the BDS movement has now connected with the Black Lives Matter movement. So that last week, Black Lives Matter did a full-on, communications propaganda uh, machine of messages related to their support for the quote Free Palestine movement, and and people just shouldn't be fooled, especially like people of conscience, like just like you and me, like we want solutions. I stood in Hebron also where the Arab families felt like they now needed to live with the nets over the bazaar, right? Because they had to protect themselves from garbage that they said that was being thrown by the settlers onto their yeah, it makes you sad. I know this because like we're
It
human.
empowers. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah,
What's happening now is that it empowers extremists and
right.
the moderate voices on both sides, right? On both the Jewish and the Arab side, and the Muslim side. And they we need more moderate voices, but they have no room. They're being shut down or suppressed and pushed aside, and that is what happens.
Yeah. We've
Right.
started a group of Muslims against anti-Semitism. We
Oh,
have some
wonderful.
amazing Muslims, Raheel Raza, Zudi Jasser, in Canada, in the United States, all over the world. Because we knew too that like as Muslims, we have to stand up against the Muslims that are part of this Islamist propaganda against Israel. And so I'm just really
I have
glad.
so much admiration for you. Just hats off to you because it is so. I think it is very hard to do what you're doing.
And
I
Asra,
think
can
it's
you
very hard.
send me some of that information because I will include it also in the blog notes so that people can find out more about that. I mean, that kind of took me to where my last question for you was, how do we do this? How do we have this conversation in the Muslim community, in the Jewish community, and even, in other communities, religion aside, where we are focusing on our common humanity. And it sounds, Asra, like you are already on that path right now.
Oh yeah, I mean, we have been working just over the last few months on this new organization, but we've been working since 2015 with this formal movement that we have called that we call the Muslim Reform Movement, and part of our agenda and our mission and our vision is to support the peaceful solution of issues in Israel without destroying Israel. This is a really fundamental idea. We have
Yeah.
to have solutions with recognition of Israel's right to exist. They have
Yeah.
they have been declared a nation. They have they have uh, battled. They have gone to war. The enemies that want to destroy it have used every tactic. Now they're using the social justice movement as a new sneaky way to try to destroy Israel. And this is, as Isabella said, this is not with blinders on our eyes. This is with like a reality that we need to find a recognizable solution for those that are in the Palestinian territories. But part of their problem is their own leadership, and so that is their own battle to fight. But we want to support all of those efforts, and definitely want to connect with everybody who wants to do that in an honest way, not this stuff of um this ridiculous movement that exists today that is just full of lies and propaganda, and also blinders. We don't want to have blinders on our eyes about anything. And so
Totally.
yeah,
Totally.
yeah.
Do you think that you are in a minority, or is that movement really starting to gather steam and have
Well, Isabella, didn't you feel such hope? I mean, earlier this year, last year, because the Arab states were finally, some of them moving along. I mean, that was
Right.
huge. The United Arab Emirates finally moved along.
Yeah.
Other nations in recognizing Israel. And so this is a conflict within Muslim countries too, because there are, I think, a majority of people who recognize the state of Israel now to exist, and they want to move forward and not backwards. But it's just like in the United States, it's these most loud, most violent, most aggressive people who steal the headlines, and people from my own profession of journalism are, just sadly falling for this
Right.
shenanigans. I mean,
Right.
the
Right.
the Associated Press not knowing that there was a Hamas office in their building is so
Right.
unbelievable.
Right.
That they're hiring a known anti-Israel activist and then firing her, but wondering whether they did the right thing is just emblematic of the fact that even journalism has become co-opted, not only on this issue, but by the woke agenda on so many issues. And that's really distressing, because we're not like neutral brokers now in this. And so I believe that what Isabella and I are talking about is the majority of people's understanding of things. It's just that most people are afraid to be called out as racist or hateful,
Right.
or
Right.
or beat up now in the streets, right?
Right.
Like, you
Right.
get beat up, and people are afraid of that. But
Exactly.
we should not have fear, because people. This is existential, and we should all have moral courage, because this is um, this is a really historical moment, as are all moments of threat to anybody's existence, and that's what we're seeing today.
Well, I agree. And I just also want to say that, I wanted to ask you, and unfortunately, I'll have to jump off in 3 minutes, but, those, like, for example, we saw these over the last several days, these convoys of cars driving through cities, like through London, I think through LA, through New York, with Hamas flags, right, yelling through megaphones, death to Jews, or rape Jews' daughters, things like that. And I read an analysis, which I thought was very interesting, which said that it's by Seth Frantzman in Jerusalem Post, who said that he views this as coordinated. These are like
Right.
ISIS-like actions now in America, in England. And what it makes me think of is that for people who think that this will just pass them by, they have to understand that historically Jews have always been the canary in the coal mine. In the coal mine. So when anti-Semitism rises, it means that there is something else in the society that is happening that will come to the surface, right? And if you kind of let the anti-Semitic hate rise, well, don't think that they will be, that it will just, they will just satisfy themselves with the Jews, right? This is like, this was a display of power, which I think was meant to intimidate not just the Jews, but everybody.
And
And we have to understand this.
Yeah, they will come for you. Whoever you are, they will come for you. And if you can imagine a day when everybody has a target on their back, that is the day that we are coming to, because and we all have to stand up, like as moderates, as nonviolent people, as peaceful people, we all have to stand up.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to talk to you, and I genuinely wish we had more time, but I'm grateful for this, and I hope that we will, you can count me as a supporter for whatever you're doing, and I hope we will do something together that can, right?
Absolutely.
We're here together. Sometimes I like to say we're daughters of Hajar and Sarah. They were separated, but we are daughters of that bloodline, and we will be together in kinship.
Love that.
Completely. Beautiful way to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bella, so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.